The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway flickered in sync with the pounding in Elias's head. For months, his life had been a blur of double shifts and late-night cleaning jobs that left his eyes burning. Every cent was swallowed by insurmountable medical bills that never seemed to shrink. His young daughter lay in a cold, sterile room behind heavy doors, her future a flickering candle in an indifferent wind. Elias was drowning on dry land, gasping for air that only money could provide. Yet the more he struggled, the deeper he sank into the abyss of debt. At 4 a.m, he reached his doorstep, his bones aching with a fatigue that sleep could no longer fix. There, resting on the porch like a silent invitation, was a sleek black briefcase. Inside, he found no cash, but an obsidian debit card and a high-tech smartphone. The screen glowed with a message. The balance is $1 million. It is yours to keep, but if you speak of its origin or existence to any living soul, the balance returns to zero immediately. Elias felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. The weight of the card in his hand was undeniably real. Early the next morning, he stood at a small, quiet grocery store, his heart hammering against his ribs. He bought milk and bread, sliding the card into the reader with trembling fingers. When it flashed approved, a rush of relief made him dizzy. But as he walked out into the sunlight, a new feeling took hold, a suffocating weight of isolation. He had the world in his pocket, but he was suddenly a man alone on an island, forbidden from calling for help. Within weeks, his life transformed. He paid off the hospital debt anonymously, telling the billing department he was a charitable benefactor who wished to remain unknown. He moved Clara and their daughter into a bright, sunny house in a safe neighborhood. But this wealth came with a price. When Clara asked how they could afford such luxury, the lie tasted like ash. He told her it was a private legal settlement from a former corporate employer in the city. He thought the lie would protect the money, but it was already poisoning his marriage. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us below where you are watching from. Clara was no fool, and the distance between them grew wider every day. She noticed how Elias jumped whenever the new phone vibrated on the nightstand. She saw him pacing the hallway at midnight, staring at a screen she wasn't allowed to see. There was no paperwork for this sudden, inexplicable fortune, and no paper trail. The intimacy they once shared, forged in the fires of their poverty, began to crumble into a cold silence. Elias was physically there, but his mind was always guarding his secret, acting as a sentinel for a fortune that required his silence as a daily tribute. Then there was Leo, Elias's younger brother, a gambling addict with a predatory talent for spotting a mark. He noticed the new clothes and the sleek, expensive car immediately. Leo knew Elias hadn't won any legal battle. He knew his brother was hiding something lucrative. He began to tail Elias, lurking at the edges of his new life like a predator waiting for a single mistake. Leo was drowning in his own debts to violent, dangerous men, and he saw his brother as his only way out. The pressure boiled over on a rainy Tuesday. Elias was leaving a clinic when he was shoved into a dark, trash-strewn alleyway. He turned to see Leo, eyes bloodshot, holding a smartphone high with the phone's recording app glowing steadily. Leo cornered him against the brick wall, his voice jagged with greed. He demanded to know where the money was coming from, convinced Elias was involved in something illegal. Elias stood trapped between Leo's greed and the briefcase rule. He was one sentence away from losing the fortune keeping his daughter alive, and the silence felt like a death sentence. Elias stared into the lens of Leo's phone, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He couldn't speak, yet he couldn't stay silent without looking guilty of something far worse than simple luck. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, he shoved past his brother, muttering about a non-disclosure agreement that didn't exist. He escaped into the pouring rain, but the victory was hollow. The secret was no longer just a burden. It was a physical weight pressing down on his chest, making every breath a labored chore. Soon, sleep became a distant memory that he could no longer afford. Every shadow on the sidewalk looked like a threat, and every ring of his phone felt like a countdown to his own destruction. He became hyper-vigilant, checking locks and staring out the window at cars that lingered too long at the curb. His eyes grew sunken, and the simple act of existing felt like hauling heavy stones. Inside the beautiful new house, the air felt thin and cold. His new luxury was a beautiful, inescapable gilded cage. Clara moved through the rooms like a ghost, her eyes red from quiet weeping during the hours he spent away. To her, the sudden wealth wasn't a blessing. It was a wall built of secrets and lies. She didn't see the $1 million as security. She saw a husband who hid his phone under his pillow and flinched at her lightest touch. She suspected an affair, or perhaps a descent into the very criminality he had always avoided. The intimacy that had survived years of poverty, the shared dreams and the whispered hopes, was dissolving in the face of this inexplicable prosperity. Elias watched her from across the dinner table, the truth burning in his throat like acid. He wanted to scream that he was doing this for them, but he looked at his daughter's healthy, vibrant face and forced himself to swallow the words. He was saving her life, but he was losing his wife's heart in the process. Meanwhile, Leo's desperation had reached a breaking point that made him reckless. The men he owed money to weren't patient, and his brother's silence felt like a personal insult. A hoarding of luck that should have been shared by blood. One afternoon, while Elias was at the hospital for a follow-up appointment, Leo broke into the home office. He felt like a scavenger picking through the ruins of his brother's integrity. He found the high-tech phone sitting on the mahogany desk, its screen glowing with a notification. When he swiped it open, his jaw dropped in sheer disbelief. The balance was staggering, a string of zeros that promised a life of leisure and an end to his mounting debts. Leo didn't see the warning message. He didn't know about the silence rule. He only saw a way out of his own grave. He didn't take the phone fearing a GPS tracker, but he took the knowledge. He left the house convinced that Elias was a middleman for a massive criminal organization. The consequence of Leo's loose lips was swifter and more brutal than Elias could have ever imagined in his worst nightmares. 2 nights later, the artificial silence of the luxury suburbs was shattered. Elias was in the kitchen when the front door splintered inward with a deafening crack. 3 men, their faces cold and professional, stepped into the light. These weren't the bumbling thugs Leo usually dealt with. These were high-level predators who enjoyed their work. They didn't want the car or the jewelry. They grabbed Clara and their daughter, forcing them onto the plush sofa at gunpoint. The child's whimpering cut through him. One of the men, a figure with a jagged scar across his knuckles, shoved Elias into a chair. They had heard rumors from a terrified Leo about a fixer with unlimited funds. They demanded a $500,000 tax. "We don't just want the cash, Elias," the lead man growled, pressing a cold barrel against Clara's temple. "We want the source. We want to know who is feeding you this money so we can tap it ourselves." Clara's eyes were wide with terror, her gaze fixed on Elias, begging for the truth. He stood at the edge of the abyss. If he spoke, the money for his daughter's surgery would vanish. If he stayed silent, his family would pay the ultimate price. Elias looked at the gun pressed against Clara's temple, the cold steel a stark contrast to the warm, golden life the $1 million had purchased. His daughter was sobbing on the floor, a sound that tore through the artificial peace of their marble-floored living room and shattered the last of his composure. The lead loan shark, his eyes hard as flint and breath smelling of stale tobacco, leaned in closer, demanding the source of the wealth. Elias felt the weight of the secret like a physical stone lodged in his throat, choking him. If he spoke the truth, the money would evaporate instantly. The hospital bills, the expensive specialists, and the future safety of his child. It would all turn to ash before his eyes. But if he stayed silent, there would be no family left to protect, only a pile of blood-stained cash. He realized in that agonizing heartbeat that the $1 million gift was never a blessing. It was a cage designed to test the strength of his bars. He had been a prisoner of his own fortune, a man who had traded his soul for a digital balance on a screen. He looked at Clara, seeing the betrayal and terror in her eyes, and he finally knew he had to choose his family over the fortune. "There is no cartel!" Elias shouted, his voice cracking but firm with a sudden desperate clarity. "There is no runner, no fixer, and no secret operation for you to exploit." The loan sharks bristled, their grips tightening on their weapons as they prepared for a lie. Elias didn't flinch. He pointed a trembling finger toward the high-tech phone sitting on the mahogany coffee table. That phone and a black briefcase appeared on my doorstep with a single rule. If I ever told a living soul where the money came from, the balance would return to zero immediately. I am telling you now, the money is gone because I chose them over you. The lead man laughed, a harsh, jagged sound of disbelief, but his greed forced him to check the evidence. He snatched the phone and tapped the glowing screen. As if responding to Elias's spoken confession, the interface began to flicker violently. The bright green numbers representing the massive fortune started to scroll downward with dizzying speed, a digital countdown to ruin. Within seconds, the screen turned a deep, blood red, and a single word flashed in bold, mocking letters. Void. The balance sat at exactly 0.00. The thugs stared in stunned silence, their leverage vanishing into the ether. Realizing there was no source to tap and no liquid cash left to steal, the risk of staying for a police shootout exceeded any potential reward. They shoved the family aside and fled into the night, leaving the front door swinging on its broken hinges. In the sudden, heavy silence of the ransacked house, Elias fell to his knees and wept. The luxury was an illusion that was already beginning to fade around them. Within days, the leases were canceled, the car was repossessed, and the expensive furniture was hauled away by men in gray uniforms. They moved back into their cramped, two-bedroom apartment where the heater rattled and the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors. But the silence that had poisoned his marriage was finally gone. Clara held him that first night on their old, sagging mattress, her forgiveness a wealth that no debit card could ever provide. Elias returned to his 3 grueling jobs, his back aching and his eyes tired. But for the first time in months, he could breathe without a weight on his chest. A week later, a plain white envelope arrived in the mail with no return address. Inside was a certified check for $50,000, the exact amount remaining for his daughter's final surgery and recovery. Accompanying it was a note on heavy cream-colored cardstock. The letter explained that the $1 million had been a character audit orchestrated by a reclusive billionaire seeking a worthy heir to his philosophy. The man had watched hundreds of people succumb to greed, choosing the fortune over their loved ones, and eventually losing both their wealth and their humanity. Elias was the first to intentionally discard the money to save his family's lives. He had passed the only test that truly mattered. Elias sat on his small porch, watching his daughter run across the patchy grass, her breath steady and her laughter bright and healthy. He wasn't a millionaire anymore, but as Clara stepped out to hand him a cup of coffee, he realized he was truly wealthy for the first time in his life. The audit was over. However, across town, on a different doorstep in a different neighborhood, a sleek black briefcase sat waiting under a flickering porch light. The cycle was beginning again, a new soul about to be weighed in the balance of $1 million secret.